One moment, Nick Reiner was surrounded by light noise and people who knew his name. Hours later, he was locked behind steel doors, stripped of privacy, and placed under constant watch. How does a life collapse that fast? What happens when wealth, status, and identity mean nothing? Inside a system built to control every movement. Is this justice, or something far more disturbing unfolding in silence? And if a man insists he is innocent, while everything around him works to break him down, how long can the mind survive before it fractures? Stay with this story, because what comes next forces us to confront how thin the line really is between freedom and total erasure. Nick Reiner is now living in what many would describe as a kind of earthly hell inside a Los Angeles jail, a place defined by filth, isolation, and a level of cruelty that far exceeds anything he had known during his years of addiction and homelessness. What makes this descent so disturbing is how abruptly it happened. Just hours earlier, he had been surrounded by bright lights, champagne glasses, and laughter at a lavish Hollywood gathering, a place where attention followed him, and reality felt distant, almost unreal. Then, without warning, that world vanished. Nick was taken from that atmosphere of noise and excess and placed into solitary confinement, a space designed to strip away all sense of comfort and time. Isolation here is not merely physical, it seeps into the mind. The cell is described as dirty and oppressive, with rats crawling through unseen corners, water systems failing without notice, and meals reduced to mouldy, stale portions that arrive day after day with no variation. These conditions alone would be enough to wear down most people, but they were only the beginning. According to reports circulating around the case, Nick has remained unwilling to admit guilt, and this refusal has placed him under even greater pressure. Each day follows the same relentless pattern: long hours alone, moments of intense distress, repeated assertions of innocence, and then silence once again. With the possibility of the harshest penalties hanging over him, a question begins to take shape almost immediately. How much punishment can a person endure before the mind starts to give way, especially when guilt has not been admitted and the future offers no clear end in sight? The descent did not unfold in chaos or noise. It happened quietly, almost mechanically, as Nick was led away from the outside world and into a space where isolation is not a side effect but a feature. The door closed behind him with a sound that carried weight, the kind that signals permanence rather than pause. From that moment on, time stopped behaving normally. Hours no longer moved forward in a familiar rhythm. They stretched, blurred, and folded in on themselves. Solitary confinement is often described as temporary, but inside it feels endless, as if the concept of later has been deliberately erased. The cell itself offered little distraction from the mind. The air was stale, the surfaces worn and unwelcoming, and the silence heavy enough to feel physical. There were no conversations to follow, no faces to read, only the faint sounds of movement beyond the walls that reminded him he was not entirely alone, yet completely cut off. In such conditions, isolation becomes more than being alone. It becomes an active force pressing inward, amplifying every thought, every fear, every memory. Basic routines quickly turned into daily trials. Meals arrived without ceremony, repetitive and unappetizing, reinforcing the sense that comfort was no longer part of the equation. Small disruptions like malfunctioning water or unclean surroundings carried an outsized psychological impact when there was no escape from them. According to accounts surrounding the case, this environment began to wear him down rapidly, not through overt violence, but through relentless deprivation of normal human contact. What troubled observers most was that Nick did not retreat into silence. He reportedly continued to insist on his innocence, repeating it into the emptiness of the cell, as if the walls themselves were the only witnesses left. Each assertion was followed by the same response: nothing. No reassurance, no resolution, just the return of isolation. With serious consequences looming and no clear sense of what came next, the pressure began to build in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. This was no longer just confinement. It was the beginning of a psychological trial that would test how long a person can remain intact when the world is reduced to four walls and unanswered questions. When Nick Reiner appeared in court for the first time, the image alone told a story that words struggled to contain. This was the public's first glimpse of him since the night that changed everything, and what they saw was not a defiant figure, but someone visibly diminished by the weight of confinement. He entered the courtroom under close supervision, wearing a thick blue protective garment, commonly used for individuals considered at risk of self-harm. The outfit was heavy and restrictive, designed not for comfort, but for control, signaling that even his own body was no longer fully his to manage. Beneath that garment, there was nothing else. No personal clothing, no fabric to offer privacy or familiarity. Every step appeared slow and deliberate, as if each movement required effort. His physical condition seemed altered thinner than in earlier images, his posture tense, his expression fixed somewhere between exhaustion and detachment. Observers noted how his eyes avoided the room, how his presence felt withdrawn, almost distant, despite being surrounded by people. He was seated beside his legal team, partially shielded from cameras, though the attempt did little to hide his condition. Shackles restrained his hands, and even the smallest motions were carefully watched. When the judge addressed him, asking procedural questions, his responses came out barely above a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, the words sounding strained as if speaking itself demanded more energy than he had left. The hearing lasted only minutes, yet the impression it left was lasting. There was no outburst, no explanation, no visible resistance. Only silence punctuated by brief, fragile replies. As he was escorted out through a side door, the image that lingered was not one of confrontation, but of isolation made visible. In that courtroom surrounded by authority and observation, Nick faced the legal system alone, without family beside him, without any outward display of support. It was a moment that underscored how completely his life had shifted from being seen and recognized to being managed and contained, his dignity reduced to something fragile and conditional. Beyond the courtroom, the place where Nick was being held carried a reputation that extended far beyond its concrete walls. Those familiar with the facility have long described it as overwhelming not only in size, but in atmosphere, a structure that feels heavy the moment one steps inside. It is a jail known for housing some of the most vulnerable detainees, including individuals struggling with severe mental health conditions, and for many, it represents a breaking point rather than a holding space. The environment itself seems to absorb despair, amplifying it through narrow corridors and crowded units where privacy is scarce and tension is constant. Inside, the air is often described as damp and suffocating. The walls marked by years of neglect, rust, and decay. Unpleasant odors linger without relief, blending into a constant reminder that hygiene and comfort are secondary concerns. According to numerous accounts, rodents move freely through cells and hallways, drawn by leftover food, and the absence of effective containment. For those inside, sleep is frequently interrupted by sounds that signal how little separation exists between humans and the conditions surrounding them. Overcrowding only deepens the strain. Inmates are often forced into cramped spaces, lying on cold surfaces with minimal bedding, their bodies pressed close together in environments that offer no sense of personal boundary. Plumbing failures and limited access to sanitation turn routine bodily needs into sources of humiliation and stress. Medical care, especially for mental health, is often described as delayed or insufficient, leaving many to deteriorate while waiting for attention. What makes this setting especially troubling is that it does not rely on spectacle or overt brutality to exert its power. Instead, it wears people down slowly through constant exposure to discomfort, noise, and neglect. For Nick, entering this facility was not simply a change of location. It was an immersion into a system where the surroundings themselves act as a form of pressure, eroding resilience day by day, and setting the stage for what was yet to come. Nick's situation became even more restrictive when he was moved into a high observation area, a section reserved for individuals considered at extreme risk. This was not presented as punishment, but as precaution, a classification based on brief evaluations, fragments of behaviour or answers given at the wrong moment. No detailed explanation was offered, and none was required. Once placed there, the rules changed completely. The cell was small, sealed in thick concrete, with a heavy steel door that left no room for negotiation. Light flooded the space without pause, a harsh fluorescent glare that remained on day and night, erasing any natural sense of time. Clothing was reduced to a single coarse garment designed to prevent harm, rough against the skin and impossible to adjust. There were no personal belongings, no objects of comfort, no reminders of life outside. Meals arrived through a narrow slot, pushed inside, without words, stripped of utensils, reinforcing the message that even basic routines were now tightly controlled. Every 15 minutes, footsteps approached, keys rattled, and a face appeared at the small window, silently watching recording movement, then disappearing again. The isolation was absolute. There were no conversations with other inmates, no phone calls, no visits. Only brief, monitored interactions with legal or medical staff broke the monotony, and even those felt distant and procedural. Around him, faint sounds echoed through the walls, shouts, sobs, and incoherent voices from others held under similar conditions, bleeding into the silence and making rest nearly impossible. In this place, surveillance was constant and inescapable, turning every breath into something observed. What was intended as protection slowly became its own form of pressure, testing how long a person could exist when privacy, rhythm, and human connection had been completely removed. As the days passed under constant observation, the pressure surrounding Nick began to shift from passive confinement to something more intense and focused. Time spent alone in the cell was interrupted by periods of questioning moments when he was brought into sterile rooms where the air felt colder and the silence more deliberate. The process followed a pattern that never fully explained itself. Questions were repeated, phrased differently, then asked again, as if persistence alone might produce a different answer. Nick continued to maintain that he had not committed the crime, and with each repetition, the atmosphere reportedly grew heavier. There were no raised voices or visible force, only a steady insistence that wore down resistance through exhaustion. Every pause, every hesitation, every change in posture was closely observed and noted. In an environment like this, even silence can feel like an accusation. According to descriptions surrounding the case, the lack of clarity about when these sessions would end added another layer of strain. Without a clear boundary between interrogation and isolation, the two began to blur, merging into a single continuous experience of pressure. Cut off from normal reassurance and deprived of any grounding sense of routine, Nick's mental state appeared increasingly fragile. The walls offered no feedback, no confirmation that his words carried weight beyond the room. Each return to the cell brought the same bright light, the same empty space, and the same awareness that nothing had changed. This cycle questioning, followed by isolation, repeated itself until the distinction between external pressure and internal doubt began to erode. What remained was a growing sense of vulnerability, the feeling of being slowly compressed by circumstances that offered no release, no resolution, and no clear end. Over time, the isolation began to take on a different weight. What had started as resistance slowly gave way to confusion as the mind searched for stability where none existed. Alone in the cell, Nick reportedly began speaking out loud, not to anyone in particular, but to fill the silence that pressed in from every direction. He repeated his claims of innocence, then drifted into moments of reflection that sounded closer to guilt, not in a legal sense, but in the deeply human way grief and shock can distort thought. In a space where there is no one to correct, reassure, or respond, the mind turns inward and begins arguing with itself. Memories of his parents surfaced repeatedly, not as clear recollections, but as fragments, voices, and questions that offered no peace. At times, he was said to apologize aloud; at other times, to deny responsibility just as firmly. These contradictions did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, creating a loop that grew more exhausting with each passing day. Observers familiar with such conditions note that isolation has a way of collapsing emotional boundaries, making it difficult to separate sorrow from blame or fear from truth. Nick's behavior reportedly became increasingly erratic, shifting between long periods of stillness and sudden emotional release. Tears, whispers, and trembling were no longer contained by privacy because privacy no longer existed. Every movement, every word was potentially witnessed, yet nothing changed as a result. This absence of response deepened the sense of abandonment. In that environment, the question was no longer about guilt or innocence alone, but about how long a person can hold on to a coherent sense of self when left alone with grief, accusation, and relentless observation, all without relief. As the psychological strain continued to mount, the reality of what lay ahead began to settle in with greater clarity. Beyond the walls of the cell and the relentless cycle of observation, a legal process was quietly advancing, one that would eventually determine whether Nick's confinement was temporary or permanent. He now faced the most serious charges available under California law, accusations that carried consequences measured not in years, but in lifetimes. The language surrounding his case shifted from immediate conditions to long-term outcomes, from what he was enduring now to what he might never escape. Although the state maintains a moratorium on executions, the possibility of the harshest penalties remained present, hovering over the proceedings like a shadow that refused to lift. Court dates were scheduled, evaluations requested, and decisions deferred, all while Nick remained confined under strict supervision. His legal team emphasized concerns about his mental condition, noting past diagnoses and the need for careful assessment before any trial could meaningfully proceed. Yet the law moves at its own pace, indifferent to the psychological toll of waiting. In this stage, uncertainty became its own burden. No verdict had been reached, no final judgment pronounced, but the future already felt narrow and unforgiving. Whether through prolonged incarceration, psychiatric confinement, or a trial that could redefine the rest of his life, the path forward appeared bleak. For Nick, the legal shadow ahead was not just about punishment, but about the slow realization that whatever outcome awaited him, the life he once knew had already slipped beyond reach, replaced by a future defined by confinement and consequence. By this stage, Nick's existence had been reduced to a narrow and repetitive loop. Wakefulness and exhaustion blended together under the same unchanging light each hour, indistinguishable from the last. There was no privacy left to reclaim, no corner of the space that was not subject to observation. Every movement, every pause, every breath unfolded under watchful eyes, turning even the smallest gestures into something measured and recorded. What once might have been moments of solitude now felt like exposure, a condition where being alone did not mean being unseen. The absence of human connection deepened this erosion. Conversations were replaced by procedures, interactions by inspections. When voices did appear, they were brief, controlled, and transactional, never lingering long enough to restore any sense of normality. Over time, the constant monitoring began to reshape his behavior, teaching caution even in stillness. To sit, to lie down, to close one's eyes became acts performed with awareness rather than instinct. In such an environment, autonomy fades quietly, not through force, but through repetition. For someone who once moved freely through public spaces, whose life had included choice, comfort, and recognition, this reduction was profound. Days passed without markers, without reassurance that the waiting served a purpose beyond endurance. What remained was survival in its most basic form, existing within boundaries that never shifted. In this state, Nick was no longer simply awaiting a legal outcome. He was living inside a system where surveillance itself had become the defining feature of daily life, shaping thought, movement, and identity alike. Looking back, the distance between Nick's former life and his current reality feels almost impossible to measure. Not long ago, he moved through spaces defined by choice and familiarity, where doors opened easily and the future still seemed flexible. Now his days unfold inside a confined environment where every action is anticipated, observed, and controlled. The transformation did not happen slowly over years. It happened in a matter of hours, collapsing an entire way of life into a routine built around isolation and waiting. What remains unresolved is not only the legal question of guilt or innocence, but a broader and more unsettling issue. At what point does confinement shift from protection to punishment of the mind? How much isolation is necessary for safety, and how much becomes something else entirely? Nick's story does not offer clear answers. Instead, it presents a portrait of a person suspended between judgment and uncertainty, living under conditions that test endurance as much as they preserve order. As he continues to wait behind locked doors under unbroken light and constant surveillance, the outcome of his case still lies ahead. But the journey itself has already left its mark. The contrast between who he was and who he has become forces a difficult reflection not only about one individual, but about the systems designed to contain, observe, and decide the fate of those placed inside them. What happens next will be determined in court, but the questions raised by this descent linger far beyond the walls that now define his world.